Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello, and welcome back once again to Compass Points, the podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, events, government, politics, and kind of anything else that gets our attention. I am Jesse Mayshark, co-founder, co-publisher, co-editor of Compass at CompassKnox.com, and I am joined, as always, by Scott Barker, who is also all of those things. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm just the co-guy.
You're the co. Well, we're both co's. Everything's co. That's good.
Yeah. How you been?
I'm okay. It's Friday. We're recording on Friday as usual. Yes. I'm always happy when it's Friday.
I am too, and I think we spent the last week in election recovery mode.
Yep.
So that was, that's kind of an occupational malady of journalists after an election's over with.
And we're actually going to be talking about that a little bit this week. A little bit later on in the podcast, we're going to have an interview with Knox County Commissioner Randy Smith, who is among those getting ready to leave office this month after 2 terms. So we'll kind of get some of his big picture thoughts on the past 8 years. We're also going to talk about an interesting town hall meeting that is not going to happen. But that stirred up a lot of discussion online this past week. We have some development news coming out of the city of Knoxville and the Planning Commission. And we will go ahead and get started by talking a little bit more about last week's election, because on last week's episode, of course, we talked about the results of that election and some of the trends and patterns we saw there. But this past week, we had the opportunity to do what we often like to do after these races, which is really dig into the precinct results, look to see which candidates did well or didn't do well, anything that broke with past patterns, try to kind of get a sense of the geography of the election. Yeah. So what leapt out at you about that, Scott?
The big thing was as every copy editor who ever worked at a newspaper where I worked, or any newspaper, will cringe when I say this, but Republicans stayed away in droves. They just did not show up to vote.
Yep.
And that was the big takeaway, because really the Democratic turnout was about the same.
Was actually a little bit down also.
Yeah, but the Republican turnout was way down.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that really leaped out. When you have 4 years ago in these same seats, the Republican candidates were getting 60% of the vote, and they're only getting 50% of the vote. Well, that was mostly because that 10% or so people who that they lost just didn't come out to vote.
Didn't show up at all. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because that was sort of obvious immediately that the overall turnout was way down from 2018, the same cycle 4 years ago. We had about 55,000 total votes in this election versus 81,000 four years earlier. But then if you go back and look at elections prior to that, it also becomes clear that that 2018 election was really exceptional, because in the 2014 race, it was around 61,000 or so. The 2010 race was around 64,000, so more than we had this year. But still, that 2018 race had tremendous turnout. It was about a 33% countywide turnout, which it doesn't sound high, but is in fact very high for that August county general, state and federal primary election. It's a bit of an odd election to have sort of right in the middle of summer, you know. But I think that there were a couple of things in 2018 that really drove that. You had a very competitive Republican primary for governor with a local guy on the ballot, Randy Boyd. When you have a local guy on the ballot for a statewide race, you're always going to get more turnout. And then there was also a really hard-fought Republican primary for the 2nd congressional district seat between then County Mayor Tim Burchett, who won that, he's now our congressman, and former state rep Jimmy Matlock, which some people remember as a race that generated there were a lot of nasty mailers and various other things, mostly, I should say, from the Matlock side. I'm sure Burchett's people would appreciate me pointing that out even 4 years later. But I think that's really what drove that. And so the local races, like the county mayor's race, for example, 4 years ago, also had very high turnout, but that's not what drove all those people to the polls. And they were mostly Republicans, or they were people who were going to vote in the Republican primary that year, which gave, for example, Glenn Jacobs in his first run 66% of the vote, as you're saying. This year, his vote share went down to 55%. He got like 51,000 votes in 2018. This year he got 30,000 votes. Huge drop off. And of course, if you're the county Democratic Party, you look at this and you say, people don't like Glenn Jacobs as much as they did 4 years ago, and all of these districts and races are now going to be more competitive going forward. If you only measure it against the 2018 election, I think that's kind of misleading because, as you say, the biggest difference between those two elections appears to be just a huge drop-off in turnout overall. Now, I think the thing that you can give the Democrats credit for is they contained that fall-off. They were down. Debbie Helsley, the Democratic candidate for county mayor this year, actually got fewer votes than Linda Haney, who ran in 2018, but only by a couple thousand. Her vote total was down about 7%, whereas Jacob's vote total was down like 42% from 4 years earlier. So I think where the Democrats can quite plausibly and reasonably claim victory is in maintaining, building, sustaining local interest in these local seats, because I really think that's what drove it for the Democrats. There was a Democratic gubernatorial primary on the ballot, but there was nobody local in that race. I didn't hear or see much about that, local Democrats talking about that. I didn't see a lot of yard signs. What I think you did see was real interest in these local races, and I think the Democrats in this cycle appear to have done a much better job at really driving that than the Republicans did.
Oh, I certainly agree. One of the things is they raised a lot of money for their candidates, a lot more than they have in years past, and they did get people to the polls at a time where the other party did not. So I think that they can, and I think that they point to this. I mean, on election night they celebrated almost like it was a victory, but I think that they also have talked about how they're trying to build momentum. They don't, I think that they're hoping the trend goes toward Democrats and away from Republicans, and we'll have to see. I mean, that's the one thing about trends. You can't just point to one event and say that's a trend. And so it's events over time, and we'll see how that trend goes.
Well, and I do think that if you look at the presidential race turnouts, which are always the highest turnout, those are the elections where we get the most voters coming out. There is a bit of a trend there going back to, say, 2004 forward. In 2004, 2008, and 2012, the Republican candidates for president, George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney, all won Knox County by more than 60%. The highest, I think, was actually Romney with 64%. running against Obama as he ran for re-election, probably showing some Republican dissatisfaction with Obama that year. But all three of them were over 60%. And then Donald Trump comes, and in 2016, his share in Knox County was 58%. And in 2020, it was 56%. So just over what Glenn Jacobs got in this past election. Now, you can also look at that and say, well, Trump himself is kind of an exception. There's some Republicans who don't like him. Maybe they sat out. Okay, but Bill Lee, when he ran for governor in 2018, he got 58% of the vote. Marsha Blackburn got 51% of the vote running for Senate against a well-known and popular former governor, Phil Bredesen. So I think you can make a pretty good case that over the past 15, 20 years, we have seen sort of a gradual shift at the countywide level toward more competitive races where Democrats in the right situation with the right candidate on the Democratic side and maybe the wrong candidate on the Republican side, they can be more competitive. And I think Republicans are noticing this.
And that worked out in the school board race.
Exactly.
4th District.
In the 4th District,
where you had Kat Bike, who was a very strong, hardworking candidate.
Although one who came in, I don't think with a lot of name recognition. She really had to build that.
No, she didn't have any name recognition, but she went out. She worked hard. She overcame a huge financial deficit, and really came out ahead in a West Knoxville district that had, I think if you were going to bet on the outcome, you probably would have bet on that being a Republican seat, and she won.
Yeah. Well, and so that seat on county commission will be up in 2 years, and whether current Commissioner Kyle Ward, who is a Republican, seeks re-election or not, I think you can bet that the Republicans are going to be they're not going to take that seat for granted. Similarly, I think the 3rd District, which had a very close county commission race this year, both parties are going to be very focused on both of those districts. Both of those districts look like they're going to be competitive, probably in and for the foreseeable future. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. We do have the full analysis, that article online at compassknox.com, available for our subscribers to read. And of course, we will get to do all of this again in November when we have yet another set of elections to look at. And we'll see if any of these maybe trends that we're seeing in this one bear out in any way there. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about development. There's one developer in particular had several items on the city council agenda this past week.
Yeah, there's a development firm called the Dominion Group. They're headquartered over on Sutherland Avenue. They've been very active lately, and they actually had 3 different things on the agenda on city council last week that was kind of an unusual circumstance. They actually asked to have one of their properties annexed into the city, which is unusual in and of itself. City officials say that it happens once a year or so, very rare nowadays. But they have they're developing an apartment complex on Maloney Road in South Knoxville, right off of Alcoa Highway. It's one of those properties that's half in the city and half in the county, and so they asked to have it annexed into the city.
Right. They said that if they could have taken the part in the city out, they would have done that. But legally, that's not.
Yeah, you can't do that legally. But they said, well, we wish we could have de-annexed, and did have an unusual discussion there because city officials and council members almost always are for annexations because that does bring in more revenue to the city and helps them with their budget.
Increases the property tax base, especially a property that's clearly going to be developed and is going to increase in value.
Yes, it's going to be developed. It will increase in value. It will bring in more revenue for the city. We had one council member, Amelia Parker, who was the one who brought up de-annexation actually in the conversation. She was saying, well, what good does this do the city? Well, other than And really, when you annex property, you've also got to provide services to that property. That really isn't much of a stretch since the city's already there. I mean, they already.
Right, that property is kind of surrounded by
it's
property in the city.
Yeah, and that's one of the features of Alcoa Highway and the corridor there. And we've talked a lot about the Alcoa Highway corridor plan. One of the things that came up about that is it is kind of a hodgepodge of properties. Property that's in the city, property that's outside the city, and kind of a checkerboard.
Right,
down.
Alcoa Highway itself and its right-of-way and some of the commercial properties along it are inside the city all the way to the Blount County line.
Right.
But once you get very far south, the property on either side is not. It's in the quote-unquote, what we call in the county.
Yeah.
Even though, of course, everything is actually in the county. Pet peeve of mine when people say in the city and in the county, because everything's in the county.
But Dominion Group also has they got a rezoning that went through on Tuesday. An interesting project downtown or downtown / East Knoxville. There's an industrial parcel that a lot of people actually overlook. It's right on the north shore of the river where the South Knoxville Bridge comes to North Knoxville.
Kind of next to like Ned McWhorter Park.
Ned McWhorter Park is next door to it. Mm-hmm. It's a little sliver of property there. It's an industrial property. It's vacant now, but they're going to go in and put in a mixed-use development. It's still in the concept stages. They're not, they don't have renderings and all of that stuff, but they've got, they're wanting it to be a mixed-use development. They have restaurants and maybe some retail as well as residences. Right now they're thinking apartments as opposed to condos, which is interesting. But it'd be right on the river, right across from, another development that they've got going in South Knoxville, right by Sutry Landing Park. So they're, in fact, with those three developments together, they're going to be adding close to 800 new rental units to the Knoxville market over the next 2 years.
Which is something everybody says we need more of. We need more residential units, period, whether they're rental or owned or whatever.
Well, in the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors, their most recent monthly report, the occupancy rate's 92% in rental units in Knox County. In other words, you can't find an apartment, and so this will, regardless of the price point. A lot of people talk about affordable housing, but even housing that's market value or upscale is hard to come by, and these three developments will add, like I said, about close to 800 units,
which would probably collectively house 1,000 to 2,000 people, depending on the size of those units.
So,
well, and I think that this is a project that Councilman Tommy Smith talked about with us when he was on the show not too long ago, because having that development on the north side of the river there is it's going to feed into this idea of kind of a connected corridor across the bridge that then can tie into the Morningside Park area and on the other side, on the south side, all the way down to kind of the urban wilderness, that there will be this sort of connected corridor of live, work, play spaces, essentially.
Yeah, that's kind of the long-term vision of that the city has for that. There are going to be long-term plans for changes to James White Parkway. Basically, put it on a diet a little bit, make it smaller, add greenways in, make it almost like a park and a road rather than just a road into South Knoxville, and like you said, connect South Knoxville, the urban wilderness, with East Knoxville and Morningside Park, and that's kind of the long-term vision. This is while this is a private development, it really isn't related directly to what the city plans to do. It certainly is within the spirit of what they're wanting to accomplish, and they're of course anytime that the government is trying to go in and improve infrastructure and those kinds of things. They're hoping private development comes in and does something, and this is an example of that, where you've got a vacant piece of property that would be turned around and used and add residents to the downtown East Knoxville area.
Speaking of another vacant piece of property, just to touch on quickly, there was a sort of interesting issue at Planning Commission this past week. Somebody wanted to build a martial arts studio and school in South Knoxville, and that got shut down by the Planning Commission.
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting thing. It's the Knoxville Martial Arts Academy. They have classes for about 300, or actually more than 300 students, from children to adults and all. And they have recently been at the old Peace Furniture building, which is a downtown Vestal landmark.
The heart of Vestal.
The heart of Vestal. Yes. Well, they thought about renovating it. Way too expensive, 7-figure renovation costs. So they can't really do that. They wanted to move. They went to buy some property further south. They bought it, and it turned out that whoever sold it also sold it to someone else, and there's a legal fight over the which deed is going to be valid. So that's kind of a separate thing. They've got this other property they bought. It's down near. It's in the county, but it's near Montgomery Village, in South Knoxville.
On Maryville Pike there.
On Maryville Pike, and so they wanted to. It's zoned for residential use. Behind it, it's mostly single-family houses, and it's zoned for single-family houses, and they wanted to rezone it for commercial use, which wouldn't be. It's kind of understandable. There's a lot of commercial zone property on Maryville Pike, up and down from where they are, and some industrial property as well. But one of the Planning Commission staff, and then the Planning Commissioners wound up agreeing with them, thought that no, it needed to stay residential, and they pointed out that there's a lot of unused commercial property in that area as well, and there is. I mean, it's one of those kind of. I hesitate to use the phrase "run down," but there are a lot of
has some blighted areas.
Yeah. There's a little bit of blight. There are a lot of empty buildings. There's some that could use some TLC. That even though they're being used, they could use some TLC and to make it at least look better. But of course, the attorney for the owners of the of martial arts club said, yeah, there's lots of vacant property there, but they don't own it.
Right. It doesn't really do them any good.
It doesn't do any good because
and maybe that property would have been more expensive or whatever. So
and there's so they're weighing their options. And one of the things that made this stand out is that all of the public input that came in, and there were 51 messages sent to the Planning Commission, and a lot of them from people who were involved in the club, but also some others from South Knoxville who they're all in favor of it.
Which you often don't see when someone wants to convert residential property to commercial.
If you want to convert residential property to commercial, you can just about guarantee that there will be community opposition to it. There was none. Not a zip, nothing. And even planning commissioners brought that up, and they said, well, we've never really had this situation where we've wanted to do this kind of rezoning, and nobody's been opposed to it. And yet they decided to stick with the staff's recommendation and reject the rezoning. So now the owners are going to resort to appealing to county commission. So that'll happen in the next month or so.
All right. Well, we'll see if there is jiu-jitsu in Maryville Pike's future or not.
That's right.
The other thing we wanted to talk about was something that sort of blew up about a week ago. It was the previous weekend online. People started sharing this sort of ambiguous, it was a screenshot of an online event announcement. It was not initially clear where it came from, announcing a town hall that was going to take place on Saturday, August 20th, with Knox County Mayor Glenn Jacobs, Sheriff Tom Spangler, out in Choteau, far southwest Knox County, to discuss public safety, but more specifically to discuss, well, first of all, it said it was for preparedness-minded people. That was the phrasing. To discuss possible threats or disruptions that could come from, and it said, social chaos or political or economic disruption. And that was all it said. That was all the information that was provided. And from that information, a lot of people got very curious. First of all, what is this? What's going on? Who is this group of preparedness-minded people that our mayor and sheriff are going to talk about? What exactly are they going to be talking about? Social chaos? What does all this mean? It transpired that the event was, some people did some online sleuthing, like we all do these days, that it looked like it was organized by a group, and I'm using that phrase carefully because I'm not clear to what degree this is a group and to what degree it might just be a couple of people. What you can find online about them is very minimal, but called Founders Alliance, which is related to another group or is maybe the same group with a different name, hard to tell, called Founders Assembly, which seemed to have some kind of connection to this organization called the Church at Planned Parenthood, which is connected in various ways to the Patriot Church in Loudoun County, which some people might be familiar with because it is a Christian nationalist church led by a guy named Ken Peters, who just moved to East Tennessee from Washington State a few years ago and has gotten, I have to say, just a tremendous amount of press and media, especially from the national media. The Washington Post alone, I think, has written 2 or 3 stories about the Patriot Church because they love to come down to East Tennessee and see people in church talking about guns and Donald Trump and the need to kind of take back America from a very evangelical Christian point of view. So all of those connections are sort of vague and a little bit tenuous. But there did seem to be some connection between all of that and this meeting that had been announced, which was enough. And again, this, it kind of started circulating on a weekend, which is a bit of an information void on weekends. That's when social media speculation can run wild. There's nobody official in any office anywhere to respond to questions. It can be hard to reach people and so forth. So by the time all of us in the media were able to start making calls about this last Monday, already it had blown up into a whole big thing online. Ultimately, what happened was it got canceled. The property owner of the venue that was going to host the meeting, which is a private barn out in Choteau, owned by a guy named Rich Levinson, who is actually a member of the Knox County Planning Commission.
Yes, he's a new member. He
just talked about the Planning Commission.
His first meeting was Thursday.
Yeah, so. He was just appointed by Mayor Glenn Jacobs, but he did not organize the meeting. I talked to him, and he said, look, he has a barn on the property that's all fixed up to be like an event venue, and he lets local community groups, church groups, people come in and use it for free, and they have picnics and get-togethers and so forth. He says he only ever intends it as a positive thing. He wants it to be a plus for the community. He said his perception of this meeting was that it was going to be local residents, mostly people who live in Choteau, talking about any kind of disruption that could be dangerous for them. They do live on a peninsula. There's only a couple roads in and out of there. There are people who live down there who also have boats, but not everybody in Choteau has a boat.
Not everybody.
And could use a boat to get out if something happened. And so he perceived it as just, sort of a community public safety meeting. Spokeswoman for Sheriff Spangler also said, he was invited to come speak to a citizens group, which happens not infrequently. and that's kind of all they knew about it. Mayor Jacobs' office did not directly respond to questions about this. However, after it got canceled, and I should say that Rich Levinson, when I talked to him, was fairly upset because the response and the blowback to this online totally caught him off guard.
Yeah.
It had already, by the time people kind of looked up the property and had connected it to him and started sending him emails and phone calls, and also his son, who is also in the real estate business. Both of them are local realtors. It had turned into this whole big kind of controversy that he wasn't even aware of. And he says that, he just had a lot of people calling, or sending emails, being very insulting, accusing them of organizing a Ku Klux Klan rally. He said one guy offered and or threatened to come burn crosses in his yard, that kind of thing. And so he just said, look, I'm just canceling. He called the organizers and said, I'm not sure exactly what you're doing here, but I don't want to deal with this, basically. Yeah. I don't want this associated with my name and my property. But he was kind of upset about being on the receiving end of all of this. So after this was canceled, Mayor Jacobs, then, who, as I said, had not responded directly to questions about it, posted a video online very strongly condemning the people who had protested or had raised questions about the meeting, condemning the fact that Rich Levinson had felt obliged to cancel it, saying that this was an example of, the radical left dictating to private property owners what they could do with their property. And he also connected it because this was the day after there had been the FBI raid of Donald Trump's residence in Florida. He kind of connected it to that. It was honestly a little unclear to me what the connection between those things was, except that I think Mayor Jacobs was unhappy about both of them.
Yes.
So he put out a video basically saying, and he literally said, this is not the America that I grew up in, that we are losing our country. And a few things about that seemed a little. I actually asked the mayor's office, because specifically about his objections to the FBI raid. I asked them if the mayor is aware that the FBI and federal agencies routinely conduct public corruption investigations. I looked it up. They average 400 to 500 a year. Offices and homes of both sitting and former public officials are raided on a pretty regular basis. It's happened in Tennessee plenty of times.
Oh, yes.
To both Republicans and Democrats. And I don't remember any public officials in those cases saying that it was some sort of sign of a police state run amok or anything. And of course, and we're not here to talk about national politics, but as this past week went along, and more information came out about what had led up to the FBI going there, the months of negotiations with Trump and his people, the kinds of records they were looking for, and so forth. You started to hear some of that initial fervor among Republicans, claiming that this was clear abuse of power by the FBI or whatever, kind of die down a little bit. I don't think Mayor Jacobs himself has circled back around to the issue. Maybe he will, maybe he won't once more information comes out. But it was an opportunity for Mayor Jacobs to kind of use social media, as he likes to do, to weigh in a very forceful way about both local and national issues, which I think is something that he's already done pretty regularly. I think if it's true that he's considering running for a higher office, which many people think, we're going to see more and more of this, of him coming out with these very strong, forceful statements, often in line, sort of in lockstep with national Republicans and so forth.
Yeah, I think one way you can connect these two events, one of them hyper-local and one of them national, is kind of the way that people reacted to them initially without knowing what was going on. The reaction to the FBI raid was, it is the overreach by the FBI. It's just harassment. All that. Nobody knew at the time what was in what the FBI was even looking for.
Yeah.
And the same with this meeting in Choteau, in that there was this huge reaction, and I think that Jacobs was right. It's mostly from people on the left. This huge reaction about it being, as Levinson mentioned, a Ku Klux Klan rally or whatever it was, without knowing what was going on. I mean, it was interesting after we wanted to find out, and it very well could have been something that was, kind of weird, but you don't know. So, it's not, it's one of those signs of the times kind of things. I think that where people are reacting immediately without finding out exactly what's going on, and it is frustrating to not know what's going on. I mean, we're reporters because we want to find out what's going on. It's very frustrating, but we're that's so it's an understandable thing. But I think it shows that that people are, and I think it's increasing, that more and more just reacting immediately,
making assumptions about something
where it might be more prudent to wait a little bit.
Yes, and I think that's something that we as reporters ourselves try very hard to do. We don't want to write about things until we've had a chance to ask about them, find out any kind of information we can about them.
Well, I mean, the Choteau thing. I mean, we heard about it. Everybody was talking about it, but what we wanted to do was find out what was going on before we actually wrote about it. And that's what reporters do.
Right. And we hope that in the interest of informed civic discourse, which I think is something that is one of the reasons that we exist. It's one of the things that Compass, I think, as part of our mission, we try to foster. It's the civic discourse is really important. It's great to have people engaged and involved. Informed civic discourse is even better. And of course, we are not your only source for this. There are many sources around town.
We're the best source for it.
We're the best source. We are the best source. But there are other sources, and we encourage everybody to, I think it always behooves people to kind of take a breath, take a look, and maybe just wait a little bit before you put up that super angry tweet or post. I mean, I know that's asking a lot. I know that some of our own elected officials are not always the best about this. Nevertheless, it's, I think, a good model. And that actually kind of sets us up nicely for our interview segment this week, because one of the things that Commissioner Randy Smith talked to us about is what he sees as a growing fractiousness and polarization, both locally and nationally, and some of the frustrations that he has with that as a soon-to-be former elected official. So let's go to that conversation. All right, joining us this week for our interview segment, we have Knox County Commissioner Randy Smith, who has represented the 3rd District on commission for the past 8 years and was not able to seek re-election this year because of term limits. We thought it would be a nice opportunity to kind of talk about some of the things he's seen in that time. It's been a pretty active 8 years. Randy is also, in his day job, the Director of Risk Management for Knox County. So he kind of sees government from a lot of different angles. Randy, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, Jesse. Good to see you and Scott.
Well, so you've been on commission for 8 years, which is now basically the longest anybody gets to be on commission because of term limits, unless you maybe get appointed to serve part of a term or something. We have had a few commissioners go a bit beyond 8 years, but that's kind of about as much institutional memory and history as the commission gets these days. So, over the course of that, so you came on in 2014, a lot of things have happened since then. What are some of the major things that stand out to you where you felt like county commission, really made a difference or really had to make tough decisions?
First, I want to say term limits are good and bad. We don't have the institutional knowledge of a Wanda Moody or Frank Luthor anymore. And that cycle may catch up at some time and create a problem.
Yeah.
The biggest things I'm proud of are the schools that we built, the roads that we've improved, and the fact that we haven't raised taxes.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard to do all of those things at once, right? Build new things, provide new services, and not expand your revenues.
Well, we hear a lot about the downside of growth. That's the upside of growth.
You mean in the sense that it provides new property taxes and that kind of thing?
Not so much the property tax, it's the sales tax that it generates and the jobs that it creates and the things like that add to the revenue line.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So obviously the last few years we've gone through some interesting times with COVID, which was a little, kind of unlike anything any of us had ever seen inside or outside of government before. What was that like? What were you hearing from the community as we kind of navigated through the early year or so of that? And how difficult was that for those of you on commission?
I'll say this, the last 2 years on commission were vastly different than my first 2 years on commission. Mm-hmm. COVID brought about a magnification of the polarization that's ripping through our society. Mm-hmm. It amplified it and it made things very tough. I probably was more of a middle of the road kind of guy on these kind of things, but it definitely changed things.
And what were you hearing from, I mean, you represent an interestingly diverse district because it has, kind of some parts of the city, quite urban areas, and then kind of stretches out into more suburban areas all the way out to Cedar Bluff and beyond.
Socially and economically, it's probably the most diverse district of the districts.
Yeah. So given all of that polarization you're talking about, what were you hearing from your own constituents during all of that? Were people kind of across the board on it?
Yeah, it was pretty much split. I'd run into people at the store. They would have one opinion. I'd go down to the next aisle to get my cookies, and I'd get another opinion.
So what would be your advice? I mean, we're going to have some new people coming on commission here, obviously. What would your advice be to them in balancing that? Because they're going to have times, right, where they're getting, maybe nice notes, maybe angry phone calls, but either way, they're going to be hearing different opinions.
You don't get nice notes.
Yeah,
you just angry emails and phone calls. My advice to anybody serving on commission is do your own homework, analyze, ask questions, and remember, you're not there to vote for the political pressures of the moment. You're there to make sure Knox County's future 10, 15, 20 years down the road is headed in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, so given that, thinking about the future, which there's been a lot of talk on commission over the last few years at some of your retreats and so forth about the need for a more comprehensive look at the future. First, can you talk a little bit about the Advanced Knox project and what you think that could provide? And then we can talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you see.
Well, Jesse, you know that I have since almost year one been an advocate for us updating our growth plans and our general plan. They're antiquated and they create sprawl. We should have been the growth committee should have been meeting every 3 years to take littler chunks of the rural area that we could put higher density on instead of leaving it all the same and we just take more of it with less density. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping Advanced Knox works out to be something great and really good. But right now, honestly, I think it's a little bit like a sector plan process. Uh-huh. Getting a lot of input from too few people and the general public's not engaged. Mm-hmm. Nobody likes traffic. Nobody likes somebody moving next to them. But those are part of life. And I hope people embrace the principle that you can either fight change or you can work with change. If you fight it, you're not going to be happy in the end. If you work with it, you may get something you like out of it.
Well, and so given that, what are the challenges that you see to the county from the public sector side being able to, support or even kind of, as you're saying, direct that growth in ways that are manageable?
Well, I think one of the problems we have in this area is a lot of our major arteries are actually state roads that originate from the city. And there has to be cooperation from the three entities to make a difference. You look at economic development, and I don't think they factor in workforce housing and affordability and how important that is to your economic development. So I'm hoping the state will start to work with us on these major arteries to give us the ability to have growth in a way that is tolerable.
Mm-hmm. You mean making some of those arteries more hospitable to a wider variety of development, mixed use, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and you have to get the public buy-in to it. And I go back to this often. I go back to the growth plan. We didn't have the political will to reconvene every 3-5 years and keep that thing updated to where we didn't turn into a sprawl county. But you also look at like Hardin Valley. Whenever it was originally proposed, it was supposed to be 5 lanes. And at the time, the political will wasn't there to push 5 lanes. So here we are 20 years later, the 5 lanes would have been much better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What about, you mentioned density earlier, and in some of the, of course, that seems like it's almost a dirty word in some sectors of the county outside the city limits.
Yeah.
How important is it to do you see this as being the county needs to encourage nodes of development where there's more density to leave other parts of it more rural? And that kind of seems to be what you're getting.
You're exactly right, Scott. And I'll give you a basic example. If you have a 100-acre tract and you put 3 units an acre on it, but you have a demand for 600, you're going to use that 100-acre tract and then the next 100-acre tract. What we need is nodes, town centers outside of the, in the county where we have density around it. That is ultimately what can preserve the rural communities, is higher density, not spread too far into them, if that makes sense.
Well, and so speaking of that, and speaking of the whole development process, there's an item up for another vote at commission this month, which will be your final commission meeting, I guess. Had this whole issue having to, you don't seem upset about that. But this whole issue of basically the jurisdiction of the Board of Zoning Appeals to hear certain kinds of appeals of development plans. And you're the one who sponsored this resolution originally, obviously with support from Mayor Glenn Jacobs. And it's produced a tremendous amount of public pushback from neighborhood associations and planning advocates and so forth. I guess, why do you think it's important to the issues you're talking about? And maybe what do you think people who oppose it are either not understanding or are reading too much into, or whatever?
Because that's a very complex question you just asked. And first, I'd like to say that this ordinance is not the silver bullet to cause de-inflation and solve our housing crisis issue, but nor is it the dagger in the heart of public input into how our zoning process works. You have to understand use by right and use by review and how they've got commingled. If your property is zoned for residence and PR, it comes back for a review to make sure you meet the subdivision codes and all the standards of PR. And then there are zonings that you have use on review. You can have a piece of neighborhood commercial property, and what uses you can use that for have to be reviewed, have to have further scrutiny by MPC and the public to determine if that is an appropriate use. We're talking about land that's zoned for houses being reviewed and able to be appealed because it's houses. You know, we've heard a lot about the BZA has made compromises and things. And there has been a couple of instances. It wasn't a wet weather stream. It was a dry bed creek, and it wasn't an access walkway. It was an easement. But a lot of times you'll just get a builder or developer that'll come there and do a compromise just to get it over with. I call it compromise by blackmail. But and I'll say this: if I had $10,000, I could stop development in Knox County for 3 months.
Just by filing appeals of
every PR, I'd file an appeal. After BZA heard it, I'd pay my $250 to go to court. I don't even have to show up. That's still another 30-day delay.
Well, one thing that as we've been following this story, one of the things that struck me is you get a lot of opposition from neighborhood groups and planning, or these organizations that support smart planning and that. Well, what we haven't heard from though are the developers. And so how big of a problem is this really? I mean, we haven't heard from developers who come out and say, oh, this forced me to raise the prices of the houses in this neighborhood by $20,000 each or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, how big of a problem is it?
Well, it's actually foresight thinking in legislation to keep. We could have this problem, as I just described, if I had $10,000. Okay. But you won't see them come out because the public already perceives them as greedy, dirty developers. So their opinion really doesn't matter if they came out publicly.
Well, and one thing I like to point out to people, because I live in an old neighborhood here in Knoxville in Oakwood Lincoln Park, dates back almost 100 years. But I can go and look at the maps and, my own old leafy city neighborhood, this was a subdivision, this was a development. And when I hear people sort of make those blanket statements about developers, I like to remind them often that unless you live in an old farmhouse out somewhere that, has no zoning or anything, you're probably living someplace that was built by a developer. Like most of us live in places that were built by developers at some point, right?
Yeah. I mean, what are we going to do? Throw a wall around Knox County to keep those migrant Americans and the foreign developers out? We've got to work with the system and tweak it. And this is just a small step in that direction. We've got to come up with a new plan that's more conducive to density in areas that are concentrated on our arteries and where our infrastructure is, or where it will be cheapest to build our infrastructure. That's the way we preserve our rural character in the outlining areas. But, to be honest with you, in 20 years, I don't think there'll be a whole lot of rural left in Knox County. Right. And we have to think about this too, Jesse and Scott. If we're going to make it hard to develop houses, what people are going to do is buy houses in surrounding counties and drive into Knox County to work. And that's going to create more traffic problems than we already have.
Sure. Well, I'm sure that'll be another long discussion at commission this month. You'll get to go out with a bang.
It's going to be a long meeting, I believe.
Yeah. Well, before I let you go, I wanted to also just get a couple of thoughts from you on the election that we just went through. Your successor was elected, and Gina Oster is going to be representing the 3rd district now. But it was a very close election, and it was much closer than you're Republican, in case people don't know that. And you won both of your, I don't think you even had an opponent in your first race, did you?
I had a Republican in the primary, but no Democrat in the general.
Right. And then
the second time around, it was reversed. I didn't have a Republican in the primary, and I had a Democrat in the general.
Right. And you won like 62% of the vote that year, I think, right?
What's interesting is I think I won 62-38, and Gina won by 1.5 points. Mm-hmm. Her opponent got 50 more votes than my opponent.
Right.
And there was 1,600 less people in District 3 that showed up to vote.
Yep.
And I think most of them were Republicans.
Right. Well, because in that 2018 year, there were a couple of big races that drew a lot of Republicans out. So definitely that would have had.
And I don't think the Democratic numbers for turnout they weren't greater than they were in 18, were they?
No, they were down a little bit. They were just down much less, basically.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think Debbie Helsley, who was the Democratic candidate for county mayor,
she got more votes.
Got fewer votes than Linda Haney did in 2018, right, but only by 7%, where Mayor Jacobs' numbers fell by like 42%, just in terms of the raw number of votes. So, right, many fewer Republicans. So do you think, I guess that's my question about that district, do you sense that that district is changing? Was this kind of a fluke election, or do we just have to wait another couple elections and see?
I don't know. I think there's a whole lot of things that go into it. I think part of it is the demographics of the district are changing somewhat. I think Republicans are a little bit complacent in Knox County. And I also think that they didn't have a whole lot of reason to get out the vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's as a Republican, it's scary. I hope they show up in November.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, there are quite a few people who have I've been talking with who brought up the idea of Republican complacency, because Republicans have pretty much dominated countywide, their elections especially. So in the last couple of decades, and so
yeah.
Even before that. But is that something that concerns you, that there are people who would vote Republican, but they don't, they figure, oh, we're going to win anyway, so why go to the polls?
That, and I also think, and I think both parties are guilty of this. They've kind of left moderate thinking people no place to go.
So some people are just staying home because they don't like the fractiousness and everything that you were talking about.
I think there's some truth to that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right. Well,
you're not going to ask me my regrets, what I'm going to miss, all that stuff.
Sure. What are your regrets? Who are you going to miss?
You're going to miss talking to the media, aren't you?
If you guys look back, you'll see that you're a very fortunate group to have actually got an interview from me.
You don't do a lot, and we appreciate it.
I don't do. I've probably done 2 or 3 the whole time I've been in office. Regrets Midway. I thought it would do better. I didn't realize that the lack of executive housing, management housing, and workforce housing would cause that location to be such a problem for companies that want to move here.
Right.
Hardin Valley Middle School. Wish I would have pushed harder to not have that on a continuous campus. That was a mistake. I wanted Level Road, Dr. McIntyre and the powers that be. People love that community concept until you got to drive through it every day.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, you win some, you lose some, right?
Yeah. I mean, hey, something will happen with Midway, and the COVID's changed a lot of that too. How businesses are organized and how they do business. But something will happen with that. The thing about this job is it's so very different from whenever I came in. The polarization is even trickled down from the national level to the local level. Mm-hmm. I wish people would respect each other more and give each other's thoughts consideration. Jesse, you and I have had many talks, and we don't agree on everything or really too many things.
Sure.
But we've always been able to be, respectful to each other.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. I think Scott and I as reporters appreciate people in public service who, take it seriously. And I will say that I feel like you always took this job seriously. You showed up at meetings knowing what was important to you. And you also, as you're sort of implying, you weren't one of the commissioners who dragged the meetings out with a lot of needless chatter. And we won't name those, but they exist.
I missed one meeting the whole time I was on commission, and that's making the assumption I make it next Monday and the following Monday.
Right.
But we just got through with the beer board, and my mom had been in the hospital and she was in rehab at the Shenandoah, and they called me and said, "We think your mom had a stroke. We're taking her to UT."
Wow.
And I was like, "Okay, I gotta go."
Yeah, that's a good reason to miss a meeting.
Yeah.
But it's, I Jesse, you know, I'm not a politician. I'm not a handshaker or a baby kisser or, how many ribbon cuttings you sing me at, because I know I didn't have anything to do with it really. But I've enjoyed the opportunity to serve. A lot of people like to sit around, especially with social media these days, and type out their complaints and get involved in all kinds of conversations that never do anything. Whenever I decided to run, it was because I had reached a point in my life where I figured it's time to try to do something as opposed to just say something. And I'm not a very articulate person, so I wasn't able to actually say everything I wanted, but I do think I did a good job of representing the people in the 3rd District and their concerns and trying to move Knox County forward into the next 20 years, because that's really what's important. Knox County is seeing tremendous growth, and there's a reason for that. There is a reason for that.
Right. All right. Well, thanks very much for the conversation. We really appreciate it. And I'll miss seeing you at those monthly meetings, probably more than you're going to miss seeing me at them.
Jesse, as Director of Risk Management, I'll be at those meetings.
Oh, you still have to come. Oh, that's right. I hadn't thought about that, but you don't have to stay for zoning.
I can sit in the audience and sip a Mountain Dew and eat popcorn and watch.
All right. Well, I'll be interested in your thoughts as a spectator.
All right. Well, thank you, guys.
And thanks again to Commissioner Smith for speaking with us. We really appreciate it. Okay, now we are to the Q&A part of the podcast. Every week we go on to our subscribers only Facebook group, one of the many benefits of being a Compass subscriber, which you can learn all about at compassknox.com. And we ask our readers if there's anything in particular they want us to talk about or mention in this week's podcast. We had a suggestion this week that I think came from our producer, Lord Seth Barber. That was you, yes. Right, Seth?
That was me.
That was you. And it was a good suggestion. He said, how about we talk about write-in votes? Sort of the, you could say, frivolous, more entertaining side of the election. Every election, there are write-in votes. I actually asked Chris Davis, who's the administrator of elections for Knox County, whether he has seen more write-in votes now that we have paper ballots, because I kind of thought that since you're already sitting there with an actual pen, is that encouraging more people to do write-ins? And he said no, really. He doesn't think it's had much effect. The people who are going to do write-ins are going to do write-ins in whatever form.
And the thing about write-in votes that a lot of people probably don't realize is that they don't count, period.
Right.
No matter if Mickey Mouse got 30,000 votes in the mayor's race, write-in votes, it wouldn't matter, because you actually have to qualify as a certified write-in candidate for your votes for you to count.
There is such a thing.
There is, yes.
As a certified write-in candidate, which we have occasionally. We've talked about before. Current city council member Amelia Parker ran a certified write-in campaign for council a couple of years ago and actually did quite well.
She did very well. Yeah, it was a very... she did surprisingly well because of the whole nature of the write-in candidacy. But the ones that we're going to look at are a little bit more frivolous.
First of all, Mickey Mouse could not be a certified write-in candidate because you have to actually meet the statutory requirements of the office, and Mickey Mouse, by being fictional, is not qualified to run for office in Knox County. Nevertheless, Mickey Mouse got some votes. He always gets some votes. Donald Duck got some votes. I didn't see any votes for Minnie. I'm not sure what the deal is, why Mickey Mouse gets votes and Minnie Mouse doesn't. We were talking last week about the fact that we're now going to have a county commission, city council, and school board that are all going to have majorities of members who are women now starting in September. So maybe it's time for people to start diversifying their write-in voting patterns.
Vote for Minnie instead of Mickey next time.
So a couple of things that we noticed in several seats where there had been competitive primaries, there were write-ins for the person who lost the primary. So for example, in the sheriff's race, which got a lot of write-ins because there was no Democrat on the ballot, and that's where you see the most write-ins often, is where you only have one party on the actual ballot. But so in the sheriff's race, J.J. Jones, who lost the Republican primary for sheriff back in May, he got a lot of write-ins, presumably from people who had voted for him in the primary.
Tyler Givens got a bunch for county mayor.
For county mayor, right.
And
exactly.
he lost the Democratic primary, but he got a lot of write-in votes.
Right.
I mean, relatively speaking, a lot.
Right, a handful, basically.
Yeah, a handful, but more than one.
Right. Also for sheriff, our internet friend and sort of, I don't know how to describe her exactly, but well-known, civically engaged internet person, Meg McMuffin.
Yes.
Not, I believe, her real name. Surprisingly, got 47 votes for sheriff, and this has become a little bit of a running, I don't know what to call it exactly. It's not a gag, but she and she has a lot of friends and supporters. She shows up in write-in votes a lot.
Quite a bit, yeah. In fact, she posted something last week about having a watch party with her. She took a picture of her cat. It was her and her cat. I'm assuming it was her cat. You don't know. It's the internet.
She has a lot of cats. That's what we know about Meg McMuffin.
Yeah.
She's very interested in local politics, and she has a lot of cats. And she got 47 write-in votes for sheriff.
Yeah.
She's pushing up against that 50 boundary.
That's
pretty good.
Well, she could probably say, I didn't go in and count. She could say she came in second.
Well, I think J.J. Jones got more votes.
Did he get
than
more?
she
Okay, I didn't count him.
I believe she came in a pretty solid third.
Well, that's good.
Pretty good.
That's a good show.
So in some of the other, so for example, in the 7th District School Board race, Sherry Garrett, who lost the Republican primary to Steve Triplett, she got a good number of write-ins. Devin Driscoll, who lost the 11th Commission District primary, he got some votes. A few others to mention. One of my favorite votes, County Commission District 3, somebody just wrote "help" in capital letters. Like, I don't know who I'm voting for, but just
help.
Please somebody help me. The Commission at-large 10th District seat, Steve Weiner, who also lost the Republican primary in May, he got some write-ins against Larson J., who was the Republican candidate in that race. Somebody else wrote in anybody but Jay Larson. And I know what they meant. They meant anybody but Larson J. And I actually see people do this with Commissioner J's name sometimes, because he sort of has two first names.
Right.
But so that person who wrote that in will be glad to know, since they were supporting anybody but Jay Larson, Larson J is not Jay Larson, and he won. So you'd think they'd be happy about that. And then you had the seat that got the office that got the most write-in votes overall was the Chancellor Section 2, which is a race that was very competitive in the Republican primary between Bud Armstrong and two other candidates. Bud Armstrong was the Republican nominee out of that, and he had no Democratic opponent. But he's also a bit of a controversial figure, former county law director, and there were 1,800 write-ins. Now, he easily won with no actual opponent. He got 30-some thousand votes, but he also had 1,800 write-ins, which ranged from, it included people who also ran for that seat in the primary. Han Solo got a vote. George Jetson, who I don't know if anybody saw this, but George Jetson's official birthday actually just happened recently. I guess in Jetson's lore, George Jetson was born on July 31st, 2022. So somewhere out there, George Jetson is now with us.
So like 40 years or so from now, we'll be all buzzing around in the
that's what it looks like.
So
and George Jetson, assuming he was born on July 31st, is much too young to actually be a candidate for Knox County office.
That's true.
As far as we know, he doesn't live in Knox County, so he would not have been an eligible candidate, but he got a vote anyway for chancellor. A few others. Somebody wrote in author Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites.
Many offices. It was the same person. You can tell by the handwriting. But I don't know what kind of office. I've read a lot of Cormac McCarthy books, and I'm a little worried about what government by Cormac McCarthy would look like.
Yeah, that would be kind of scary, I think. Well, one thing is we wouldn't hear a lot from him, I don't think.
He's
kind of reclusive as it is, and I think
guy.
that even if he got even if he got elected, I don't think he would be holding very many press conferences or anything.
Yeah, I don't think so either. One of my favorite votes, it showed up at the top of the list for a criminal court judge. Somebody voted for Janet Jackson, which I thought was a strong vote. That's Judge Jackson if you're nasty. I could get on board with a Janet Jackson candidacy. And then you had people voting for MAGA, other people on the other side writing in F Trump. I guess I could actually just come out and say that word. We're on a podcast. We can say whatever we want. I don't want to offend anybody, though. People voted for no Republican or any Democrat or non-fascist. And then Donald Trump himself also got a good number of write-in votes for a variety of offices. So, these are the things that I guess occur to people when they're sitting there filling out their ballots.
Yeah, it's if you're not taking the trouble to vote, I don't know why you wouldn't vote or even just skip. But, instead of skipping one, they'll just have a little fun with it. And, as we said earlier, they don't really count. So it's almost
I will say
vote,
I did actually write in for one office, and I won't say which office or who I wrote in, but I like to do it because then when you pull the write-in ballots and look at them, because you just actually get sort of like a photo image of everybody's write-ins, you can find yours. It's a good way to make sure your vote got counted. I found the one I voted for. I recognized my own handwriting, so I'm confident that my ballot did get counted. Thank you, Chris Davis.
And I appreciate your support. Because I'm sure you voted for me.
That was not me. Did you get a vote?
No.
Next time, somebody write in Scott Barker.
The people of Knox County are much too smart to vote for me, even when it doesn't matter.
I would vote for you, Scott. I'd vote for you for any number of things. Okay, so that is our Q&A section for the week. And again, our subscribers, next week we will again give you an opportunity to tell us what you want us to talk about. Looking ahead to this coming week, there's not a whole lot on the kind of official calendar. County Commission is holding their monthly work session on Monday, and a couple interesting things on there. I think the most contentious thing that they're dealing with this month is this Board of Zoning Appeals issue that we have talked about a lot and that we just talked to Randy Smith about in the interview. There may be discussion of that at the work session. Probably most of that's going to happen at their regular meeting the following Monday. They are also going to talk about the expanded TIF district for the downtown stadium, which we also talked about last week. City Council has approved that, and now County Commission.
City Council is going to be considering it at their next meeting, which will be at the end of the month. The Commission is going to be talking about it at the work session this week, and the next week, everybody's going to get sick of hearing about the stadium and the TIF district, because we're going to have County Commission, City Council, and the Sports Authority in a space of 2 days,
right,
all of them voting on whether to approve this expanded TIF district and the loan that from Randy Boyd to help pay for the stadium. So Everybody's going to get sick of that. We won't talk about that much now.
Right, because that'll be that week of the 22nd and 23rd is when those meetings will happen. Right.
Right.
And the other thing County Commission is talking about is lowering their tax rate. And we talked about City Council doing this for the city tax rate. County Commission is also going to lower the counties, again, because of the countywide reappraisal. The county rate is now going to fall to $1.55, or actually 1.554 per $100 assessed, which, as we talked about a month or so ago, is at least the lowest that county rate has been since World War II, quite possibly even longer than that. And that's just something that they don't even have a choice whether to approve it or not. They have to lower it. And so that will show up in everybody's property tax bills. And anything else we need to talk about next week?
Well, no, like you said, the official calendar is a little light, which means that we get to look at some other stories that aren't necessarily, tied to pending government actions. One story that I'll tease a little bit that I'll be working on is there's a new state law that will result in the county especially paying more for infrastructure improvements. So it's complicated. It's interesting. It also involves property rights. So we'll be diving into it. It's complicated, but kind of worth unpacking a little bit because it will, as I said, make some infrastructure projects more expensive.
All right. Well, we will look forward to that story and to talking about it next week. And we will be back with you next week. Thanks, as always, to our producer, Lord Seth Barber and Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by William Wright, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.